Today we are talking about Victorian London, what the city actually looked like. What if you're the most powerful city in the world, that is to have an empire that a quarter of a dangerous, most chaotic, most extraordinary being could ever live. It was also one of the most dangerous, most chaotic, and most extraordinary places a human being could ever live.
5 million souls packed into a city that had no empire that controlled 1/4 of the entire world's land surface. Every ship that docked at the Thames brought cotton from India, tea from China, gold from South Africa. The first thing that would hit you before you saw anything was the smell. Coal smoke hanging so thick in the air it turned daylight brown. Horse manure covering every street, and with 300,000 horses working the city daily, the volume was staggering. The first thing that would hit you before you saw anything was the smell. The Thames, still only partially cleaned after the great stink of 1858, carrying the waste of millions downstream. Victorian London was magnificent and filthy in equal measure, glorious and brutal, powerful and deeply, shockingly unequal. A city of stark contrast where wealth and poverty collided. Here, on the teeming docks of the Thames, the brutal machinery of empire turned relentlessly. The powerful grew richer, while the labouring poor toiled in the shadow of St. Paul's. Regent Street, gleaming with gaslit shop windows, department stores a brand new invention, this men in top hats taking the afternoon air. This London felt like the centre of the universe. The gentlemen's clubs of Pall Mall were where empires were decided over brandy and cigars. Parliament debated the fate of nations just minutes away. But walk just 2 miles east, and you entered a completely different world. Narrow streets so crowded you could barely move. But walk just 2 miles east, and you entered a completely different world. Narrow streets so crowded you could barely move.
Tenement buildings housing 20 people in rooms designed for 4. Irish immigrants, Jewish rape from G Sturo, Swede sellers, match girls, altar crowd, another pancake curl, children crossing. Yet in this world of hardship, moments of quiet reflection offered the only solace for these young souls.
Please, just one more day.
The average life expectancy in Whitechapel in the 1880s was 29 years. 29. In Mayfair, just 2 miles away, wealthy Londoners routinely lived into their 70s. And then, just 3 years later in 1888, the Whitechapel murders would shock the world, exposing the brutal realities of poverty in these very streets.
Same sky, completely different worlds.
Jack the Ripper would stalk these very streets. And suddenly the whole world would be forced to look at what life in the East End actually meant. Jack the Ripper would stalk these very streets. And suddenly the whole world would be forced to look at what life in the East End actually meant.
The Thames in the 1880s was the busiest waterway on Earth. Thousands of ships moved in both directions at once. The docks at the East End employed tens of thousands, loading cargo from every corner of the empire. The docks at the East End employed tens of thousands of men, loading and unloading cargo from every corner of the empire. A vital artery of the British Empire.
Tower Bridge wasn't finished yet. It would open in 1894, but the old London Bridge was here, and crossing it meant pushing through a wall of people, carts and animals so dense it could take 30 minutes to walk 100 yards, same thing. The old London Bridge was here, and crossing it meant pushing through a wall of people, carts and animals. The river smelled. It roared with activity. It was the lifeblood of everything.
The London Underground, already 15 years old.
The tunnels filled with smoke and sulphur. Workers from the suburbs poured into the city centre each morning aboard these mighty machines. Passengers arrived at their destinations with black smudges on their collars and burning eyes. But they came anyway because the underground was faster than anything above ground, and time in London had already become the most precious commodity of all. Despite the black smudges on their collars and the burning in their eyes, they pressed on. The underground was faster than anything above ground. The costermongers, street sellers pushing barrows through the street, eel sellers, flower girls, hot chestnut vendors filling the cold air with steam and smell. The crossing sweepers clearing paths through the mud for ladies who couldn't afford to ruin their skirts. The mudlarks' children wading into the Thames at low tide to scavenge for coins and coal and anything they could sell.
Got a bit of coal here.
Look, a farthing!
These young mudlarks braved the filthy Thames mud every day, hoping for any scrap that could be sold to help their struggling families survive.
Found one!
More tea, dear?
Yeah. Thank you, Mother. Will we really see the world one day?
Yes, like on the map, with trains and ships.
They weren't entirely wrong, but they weren't entirely right either.
Electric lighting was just beginning to replace gas lamps on the wealthiest streets. The telephone had just invented newspapers to meet working meningen to heel Flanderpil.
The telephone had just been invented, Newspapers were reaching millions of readers for the first time. Growing calls for women's suffrage were being planted in the very streets we've just walked.
Socialist movements were gathering in back rooms, printing pamphlets that would change the political landscape of the entire Western world. Victorian London was a city of extraordinary contradictions. The most powerful and the most wretched. The most modern and the most medieval. The most confident and the most anxious. The British Empire was at its end. The deep undercurrents of change were beginning to stir. Social unrest and calls for reform whispered through the streets.
5 million people, living, working, suffering, thriving, in a space you could walk across in a few hours. No internet, no phones, no cars, just human beings pressed up against each other in the fog and the gaslight and the coal smoke.
5 million people pressed together in this ancient city, living, working, suffering, thriving, all within a space you could walk across in just a few hours.
And out of that pressure, that impossible, grinding, glorious pressure, came Charles Dickens. Sherlock Holmes, the Attack Department Store, the modern newspaper, the labour movement, the suffragettes, everything we think of as modern has to ruin life as its grey dawn.
On the corner of Whitechapel Road, a young match girl endures the rain, her tray of lucifers a symbol of her daily struggle. Her fragile voice calls out, a poignant reminder of the harsh lives led in the shadows of Victorian London.
The Times this morning reports on the latest from the continent.
Your breakfast, sir.
Thank you, Mary.
Will that be all, sir?
Yes, the news from Paris is quite intriguing.
They all lived in the same city. They all breathed the same coal smoke. In the shadow of progress, their daily lives unfolded on these very streets. They all looked up at the same foggy London sky. And without knowing it, without any of them knowing it, they were building the world you and I live in today.
And now that is the Victorian London, what the city actually looked like.
Don't forget to subscribe for more updates.